Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Welcome to this week's edition of Coal, Iron, Lime and a little bit of gospel. I'm in the Dudley Port area of Tipton today because next week sees the 102nd anniversary of a disaster. Those injured were young women, teenagers, and it was caused by the sheer greed and negligence of a factory owner. But first, let's have an opening prayer. God, in Jesus Christ, you showed your love for all your people. Help us to tell others of that love, to remove the barriers which others may perceive separate them from you. Help us to proclaim dignity, worth, and justice for all. Late on the morning of the 6th of March 1922, Florence Bryant came here to Groveland Road. She was the mother of Gladys Bryant, a 14-year-old girl who just started work at the Dudley Port Phosphor Bronze Company, which was also known as L.K. Knowles Metals. Florence had heard bad things about the place. She came to collect her daughter, to take her to safety. She didn't have to work here anymore. Unfortunately, it was too late. As Florence and Gladys were leaving the factory, just walking through the door, there was an enormous explosion behind them. They were thrown to the ground. Florence was seriously injured, but would survive. Gladys, on the other hand, was terribly injured. Injuries that later that day would lead to her death in Dudley Guest Hospital. Florence and Gladys weren't the only victims of the explosion that happened here in Dudley Port on the 6th of March 1922. At the end of World War I, there were millions of unused rifle cartridges. These rifle cartridges contained valuable metals that could be reclaimed. And so it was that particular metal reclamation companies were licensed to carry out this dangerous work, which involved cutting the cartridges open, emptying the explosives out, and then dividing the cartridges into their constituent metal parts. Licensing was essential because it was a dangerous task. There were strict requirements for the factories undertaking the work. There could be no naked flames. Those working, usually young women, should only work in groups of 2 or 3, separated by blast walls. Clothing that was worn should be non-flammable. And shoes should be without the nails that were customary part of the soles at the time. The floor should also be constructed so as to prevent sparking that might ignite the gunpowder. The Premier Aluminium Company of Hay Mills, Birmingham, bought 45 million rounds of .22 ammunition. Of course, they couldn't handle that amount in-house, so they made a quick profit and sold some of it on. 160 tons of which was bought for dismantling at an unlicensed premises here in Dudley Port. J.K. Knowles Metals. By all accounts, it was a dangerous location. For a start off, there was a stove in the middle of the workshop, naked flame. There was a concrete floor, and the young women who worked here were just told to wear their ordinary clothes and their ordinary shoes, many of which would contain nails that could spark on the concrete floor. All sorts of stories go around as to what happened within that factory. It's said that there was no means of disposing legally of the gunpowder. Girls were just told to empty it in a bucket and go and throw it in the nearby canal. It was in those situations that the explosion of the 6th of March 1922 took place. Of the 24 young women who were working here, 19 of them would die. Some instantly, others appallingly burnt and with injuries from flying metal too, would die later in Dudley Guest Hospital. 19 young women, aged between 13 and 16. Most of them were in the 14 and 15-year age range. This was a terrible disaster, and it led, understandably enough, to an inquiry. Questions were asked in Parliament, and ultimately there was a court case. The owner of this metal company where the explosion took place was Louisa Kate Knowles, but it was her husband who managed the plant who was tried for manslaughter. John Walter Knowles received a prison sentence of 5 years for a terrible act of negligence, motivated by the greed to reclaim metals at the lowest possible expense. I've now made the short journey into Tipton Cemetery, and behind me is the memorial to the 19 girls who died in the explosion, and also to other individuals who were injured, who died in subsequent years. 1922, yes, 2 years ago, there was a centenary event to commemorate the tragedy that happened in Dudley Port. As I say, history always has lessons for us today. And the Dudley Port explosion was caused by negligence, and negligence that was motivated by greed. It's still the case today, particularly that the poor are often facing injustice and danger. In today's Gospel reading, Jesus is addressing a situation in the temple where the poor were effectively being denied access to part of worship. Our Gospel reading from John's Gospel by the Reverend Phil Summers.
The Passover of the Judeans was near, and Jesus made his way up to Jerusalem. And in the temple there he found people selling cattle, sheep and doves, and money changers sat around at their tables. Making a whip out of cords, he drove out the sheep and the cattle. The money that belonged to the money changers, he poured out, he overturned their tables, and to those who were selling doves he said, "Take these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for my house will eat away at him." The Judeans then challenged him, saying, "What sign can you show us for doing these things?" And Jesus replied, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days." And the Judeans said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days. But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body.
That Gospel reading is a reminder that anger in itself is not a sin. All of the Gospels portray Jesus as being angry in the temple forecourts. But they do it in rather different ways. For Matthew, Mark and Luke, the event is recalled at the beginning of the final week of Jesus' ministry. It's placed after the events that we recall on Palm Sunday. And Jesus' actions in the temple, overturning the tables, is the source of the final conflict between the religious and civil authorities and Jesus. John approaches it from a rather different perspective, and he places that event at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, some 3 years before the events of the cross and the resurrection. There's also a slight difference in language, because John talks about the temple being turned into a marketplace, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about the temple being turned into a den of thieves. So what's going on? Well, at the time of Jesus, but not now, the Jewish faith was a sacrificial religion. You could take animals to the temple and sacrifice them to God, and it was understood that this was a way of earning God's forgiveness. But you couldn't bring just any old creature. You were supposed to bring doves, or lambs, or goats. But the creature that you brought had to be without blemish. And it was easy for the temple authorities to say to someone, "That pigeon isn't perfect to offer to the Lord. You need to buy one off us that has our approval." And the same went with the sheep or the lambs. But also, people couldn't buy with their ordinary currency. They had to change it first for temple money. And of course, all this, the sale of the animals and the exchange rate, worked in the favour of the traders and very much against the worshippers. So effectively, the poorest in society were being denied access to their expression of faith. It was an issue of injustice, and that's what made Jesus angry. When we heard about the Dudley port explosion, doubtless it makes us angry as well. Because that wasn't just an event that happened over 100 years ago. It still happens today, right across the world, even in this country, that those who are poor are sometimes placed in danger because of the greed of others. Our God is a God of justice and a God of peace, because our God is a God who loves each and every individual, regardless of what other people think of their worth. We are all equal before God, and we all come to God in faith. For our incapacity to feel the sufferings of others and our tendency to live comfortably with injustice, God forgive us. For the self-righteousness which denies guilt and the self-interest which strangles compassion, God forgive us. For those who live their lives in careless unconcern, who cry peace, peace, when there is no peace, God forgive us. For our failings in community, our lack of understanding, we ask your mercy. For our lack of forgiveness, openness, sensitivity, God forgive us. For the times we were too eager to be better than others, when we are too rushed to care, when we are too tired to bother, when we don't really listen, when we are too quick to act from motives other than love, God forgive us. Thank you as always for taking time to join me for coal, iron, lime and a bit of gospel. I'll be back next week with another thought from a place I haven't really decided on yet. In the week that lies ahead, take care, stay safe, and remember that the best of all, God is with us.